The New South Wales Premier has announced a mask mandate in indoor areas from midnight after the state recorded 7 new local coronavirus infections. Reporter Kathleen Calderwood joins me now live from Sydney. Kathleen, take us through the latest figures from today.
Well, Miriam, here in New South Wales, there are 7 new locally acquired cases and 12 new cases in hotel quarantine. Now, of those 7 local cases, 5 are linked to the Baralla cluster, and that now has a total of 7 people in it, a man in his 40s, 5 of his family members and a co-worker. And there is some concern about that Baralla cluster potentially blowing up because it appears one of the cases is a staff member at the BWS in Baralla, and there is a long list of possible times every day from the 22nd through to the 31st of December for a number of hours each day. So there's a strong urging from the Chief Health Officer today for people who may have been at that BWS to check the New South Wales Health website for those times and to get tested and isolate until they get a negative result if they have attended at any of those times. Now, in addition to the 5 in the Baralla cluster, there's also a new case linked to a patient transport worker in Sydney. And finally, there's one more case from southwestern Sydney where the origin of that infection is still under investigation.
And Kathleen, what are the changes to restrictions that have been announced?
Well, the Premier Gladys Berejiklian has announced that from midnight tonight, mask wearing will be compulsory around Greater Sydney in a number of certain indoor settings. Now, it's worth noting that the southern part of the Northern Beaches zone will now be counted as part of Greater Sydney, and they won't be under those stay-at-home orders, only the northern part of the Northern Beaches. So the southern part of the Northern Beaches aren't under the stay-at-home orders, but they will be affected by these mask-wearing requirements. It does start tonight at midnight, but they won't be enforcing it until Monday with a $200 fine if you're found not to be wearing a mask. Here's what the Premier had to say.
If you're going shopping or in shopping centres, you have to wear a mask. If you're catching public transport, you have to wear a mask. If you're attending an indoor entertainment venue like a cinema, you have to wear a mask. Places of worship, hair and beauty salons, in gaming areas of establishments, and staff at hospitality venues. Now, none of this will be a surprise. We'd already strongly recommended mask wearing in these settings, but what we want to do is to make sure we're not in a situation where we're restricting people's ability to go about their business. In fact, we want to increase economic activity, not diminish economic activity, and mask wearing in these settings will ensure we have the confidence to do that.
Gladys Berejiklian there. And Kathleen, what about the third test at the SCG?
Well, Miriam, this really is the question on everyone's lips. That test is only 5 days away. And in addition to those, that mask wearing requirement, they've also tightened some restrictions around gatherings. So, gym classes are being reduced to 30 people. Places of worship and other religious services are limited to 1 person per 4 square metres or to 100 people. Now, outdoor performances and protests are going to be limited to 500 people. And finally, controlled outdoor gatherings, so those ones that are seated, ticketed or enclosed, are reduced to 2,000 people. Now, obviously, the third test is going to have a lot more than 2,000 people. We're expecting at least 20,000. And they won't be enforcing mask wearing at the SCG, although it is strongly encouraged. Now, at this stage, people will have to wear masks on their way to the SCG on public transport, but not once they get there. And the Chief Health Officer today has said that she feels confident that the zoning controls that they have will be enough to deal with, I guess, the transmission risk there. But they are actually having a walkthrough, that is health authorities and the organisers at the SCG are doing a walkthrough today to ensure that the COVID-safe plan they have in place is up to scratch. But certainly they are still saying that they feel confident that this event can go ahead.
Reporter Kathleen Calderwood with all the latest there in Sydney. To some breaking news out of Victoria. A pair who absconded from Melbourne Airport after being told they would have to quarantine for 14 days have handed themselves into police in regional New South Wales. A 24-year-old woman and a 26-year-old man have presented themselves at Goulburn Police Station at 10 o'clock today. They've been directed to self-isolate at their home in southern New South Wales, while New South Wales Police seek urgent advice from New South Wales Health. Victorian Police have been advised, and the couple will be subject to random spot checks from New South Wales Police during their time in isolation. Victoria has recorded 12 new COVID cases in the past 24 hours. The new infections bring the total number of active cases in the state to 29. Reporter Nicole Asher joins me now from Melbourne. Nicole, how are health authorities responding to those new cases?
So the message from health authorities today is for people to go out and get tested, but we are hearing that there are really long lines at testing sites, as there were yesterday. We've heard that there are 18,000 tests were completed yesterday, but there are many thousands that were still to be finished. The directive was for anyone who'd crossed the border yesterday to go and get tested, so I think that is adding to these long lines. Extra testing staff are getting brought in to help ease the load, but we now know that this case linked to the Black Rocks area in Melbourne, it has now reached 18. So there were 10 cases confirmed in the past 24 hours. That includes 2 cases that were identified in New South Wales but traced back to people from Victoria who travelled before they realised that they were part of this exposure site. But here's what the authorities have to say.
Not yet identified the individual connection point between the New South Wales outbreak and ourselves. That work continues at this point. We know that the 21st of December was the first known contact point within Victoria. That is now 12 days ago. We are very keen to establish any other change of transmission that may be happening. And until we find that absolute connection point, we'll have to continue to search very hard indeed.
Jerome Waimai there. And Nicole, the New South Wales Victorian border, that closed overnight at midnight.
That's right. So we've seen some of the mad rush pictures of people trying to get across the border before it closed yesterday. But anyone who's missed that opportunity will now either have to apply for an exemption and go into hotel quarantine or stay in New South Wales for the foreseeable future. And we're not quite sure how long this border closure will last. But the authorities are really hoping that it'll help them get on top of this cluster happening in Victoria and stop any further cases coming across that border. Now, genomic testing has now linked this Victorian cluster directly to the clusters in New South Wales. So it's kind of narrowing down where it's come from, but they're still just trying to establish exactly that link. But as I said, the Health Minister, Martin Foley, says that they're really hoping that it'll help them get the jump on cases increasing.
We are determined to get on top of it, and I know that requires what appears to some people to be tough measures. But the virus does not respect state borders, the virus does not respect holiday periods, and the virus does not respect many things. And we need to make sure that we stay ahead of this cluster and we take all the necessary measures we can to make sure that we bring it under control as soon as possible.
That was Martin Foley there. And Nicole, we've heard about 2 people who absconded from Melbourne Airport. They've now handed themselves into police in New South Wales. Can you provide us with any details about the circumstances of this situation?
That's right. So we're told that this couple, a 24-year-old and a 26-year-old, travelled from Canberra Airport into Melbourne Airport last night at landing at about 11 o'clock. And allegedly, that when they were told that they'd have to go into hotel quarantine, they jumped in a car. If somebody came to pick them up, and they left the airport against the messages and the regulations in place. Now we're told that they then headed back into New South Wales to Goulburn. We now know that they've handed themselves into Goulburn Police Station, but they've allegedly broken or breached multiple public health laws here in Victoria, and the Health Minister says that they could each be facing fines of more than $19,000.
Our reporter Nicole Asher there with the latest in Melbourne. The ACT's border has just slammed shut to New South Wales as new travel restrictions came into effect a few minutes ago at midday today. Reporter Isaac Naruzi is at the ACT New South Wales border on the Federal Highway. Isaac, what sparked these changes today?
Well, Miriam, it really has to do with the sheer volume of people from the COVID-affected areas in New South Wales that were coming into the ACT over the past few days. We've seen about 80 people coming in from those areas to the ACT. To put that into a little bit of context, we have 2,000 people in quarantine in Canberra at the moment, and 25% of those, about 500 people, aren't ACT residents. So there's a little bit of worry that the system could be overloaded, and that really drove the decision to tighten the restrictions. And from midday today, as you can see next to me, there is a police presence here. People are being pulled aside, asked about whether or not they should be here. We've already seen one person from New South Wales being turned around as we speak. So they're taking this very seriously, and anyone who falls through the cracks and is found in the ACT when they shouldn't be will be penalised.
And Isaac, what will it mean for Canberrans who are wanting to return home?
Well, Canberrans in those COVID-affected areas in New South Wales are allowed to come back. They are exempt, but before they do so, they must notify health authorities in Canberra and go into isolation for 14 days. So they're allowed back, and New South Wales residents with special exemptions will be allowed in as well, but they'll need to apply for those exemptions about 3 days before coming, and it's only under really special circumstances that they'll be allowed in. It's also important to note that we have a lot of surrounding regions in the ACT, places like Yass, Murray Bateman, Queanbeyan. Those places are not affected by these restrictions.
Our reporter Isaac Naruzi there with the latest on the New South Wales ACT border.